Hi there, everybody. My name is Lev. I am an independent animator. I am an artist, so I'm going to come at this from an artist perspective. The title of my presentation is Recreating the Creator-Driven Cartoon, How Ralph Bakshi, John Kricfalusi, and Mighty Mouse ushered in a new era of TV animation. And my thesis is that Mighty Mouse, The New Adventures from 1987 fundamentally changed the landscape of TV animation. And this was primarily achieved through three pillars: artist ownership, style, and fluidity of vision. So this all goes back to the Termite Terrace studio that you heard about a lot today, Leon Schlesinger's studio at Warner Brothers. Leon Schlesinger was the producer of the Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies cartoons, and he was a famously hands-off producer. Generally did not care what his artists made as long as they made him money, which, as we all know, they did. The Looney Tunes were wildly successful. And so what that meant is that the artists at the Termite Terrace studio had a considerable amount of creative freedom, especially by today's standards. They also worked in something called a unit system, in which tight-knit groups of artists would work together on their own productions with their own dedicated directors. And so what that allowed for was intimate creative control, or artist ownership, as well as the ability for individual directors to implement and develop their own trademark styles. The Warner Brothers style was also allowed to drastically evolve over this relatively short period of time, thanks in large part to the fact that there were no pre-existing business models yet in place, and that the artists were essentially making it up as they went along, something which had become virtually outlawed in the days of television, market testing, ratings, and sponsors. Come the 1960s, the medium of animation would trade hands from the animators to the executives. The man who would change all this is Ralph Bakshi, otherwise known as the bad boy of animation, famed X-rated feature film director who fundamentally changed audiences' expectations of what an animated film could be with his 1972 film, Fritz the Cat. But before all that, Ralph Bakshi worked his first job when he was only 18 at Terrytoon Studios out of New Rochelle, New York, the studio famous for producing the original Mighty Mouse cartoons from the 1940s. His first job was as a cell painter on those Mighty Mouse cartoons. Bakshi would eventually rise the ranks of the Mighty Mouse studio, becoming a full-fledged animator in 1959, and then a creative director in 1963. Then he would serve less than 1 year as the head of Paramount's ill-fated animated shorts division, and then in the years 1967 and 1968 did low-budget Saturday morning cartoons for producer Steve Krantz, the sci-fi series Rocket Robin Hood, and the 1968 Spider-Man cartoon. But then in the fall of 1969, Bakshi and Krantz, more interested in the world of underground comic strips, turned their sights to R. Crumb's Fritz the Cat. And then the following decade would be defined by Bakshi's groundbreaking and controversial film output. John Kricfalusi got his start in 1979 working at Filmation, where incidentally, he too worked on an iteration of Mighty Mouse. Filmation did a 1979 Mighty Mouse, a cartoon which Kricfalusi does not hesitate to call horrible beyond belief. But then in 1983, Kricfalusi shows his portfolio to Ralph Bakshi, because Ralph Bakshi was looking for young, funny animators to do a new series of theatrical shorts. He wanted to get into funny cartoons again. Kricfalusi showed his portfolio. Bakshi purportedly laughed at it, called it some funny shit, and then he asked him a question: "Where do they let you do this shit? No one will let you do this." To which Kricfalusi responded, "That's right, they won't let me do it. Everybody tones down everything I do." "Well, I'll fucking let you do it," responded a sunflower seed chewing Ralph Bakshi, spitting in Kricfalusi's face, and after that, the ball got rolling. So now, with Kricfalusi under Bakshi's wings, Bakshi turns his sights once again to the world of Saturday morning cartoons, the world he had abandoned just a decade and a half prior. So Bakshi and Kricfalusi develop all these original cartoon ideas, and then Bakshi sets up meetings with the three major networks at the time: ABC, NBC, and CBS. However, the landscape of TV animation in the mid-1980s was dominated by virulent commercialism, contrived formulas, and worst of all, a term called marquee value. The philosophy behind being that children wouldn't take a liking to any cartoon characters that they didn't already recognize. which is fundamentally absurd because obviously every cartoon character at some point begins as an original idea, but that just wasn't the market that TV networks were in anymore. You see all the major cartoons you have in the 80s. There's a Happy Days cartoon. You got the the Super Friends, a cartoon that Kricfalusi actually worked on at Filmation. Richie Rich Show, Heathcliff, Scooby-Doo. They're constantly reviving those old properties. So, predictably, each network that Bakshi meets with turns down every idea that he and Kricfalusi had come up with. CBS is the last network that Bakshi meets with. And after turning down every idea he comes in with, he, in his desperation, comes up with Mighty Mouse, the cartoon that he worked on when he was 18. A cartoon that he had not given a second of thought since then, and a cartoon that he did not even own the rights to. But it was an existing property. The head of programming for CBS, Judy Price, said, "That's a perfect hit show," and bought it on the spot. And that's how Mighty Mouse: The New Adventures was born, on a whim and as a bluff. So Bakshi encouraged his team on Mighty Mouse, led by Kricfalusi as their director, to write basically whatever stories they wished. And if the network ever got on their case about it, Bakshi made sure to defend them. Thad Komorowski, in his book Sick Little Monkeys, which is a great book about the making of Ren and Stimpy, says, "The artists in the studios never saw a single note from CBS or Standards and Practices. Bakshi kept them all. Some suspect he burned them. Others claim they saw him hang up the phone when he got the censor to admit that they didn't have any actual legal authority over the production. Other anecdotes involve Bakshi distracting studio executives when they viewed rushes of the episodes. Whenever a particularly risque joke was about to appear on the screen, he would turn to the executive and be like, wacky cartoon, huh? Did you see the baseball game last night? Crazy game, huh?" This is a quote from John Kricfalusi. "Ralph, like me, believes in and practices individual vision. His cartoons can only be made by him, and I think that's why he gave me a shot, is he saw my own quirkiness and took a chance that it might click with the audience. No one at that time would have." Kricfalusi quickly forms a crew of some 30-some artists to work on Mighty Mouse, most of which were working other dead and creatively bankrupt Saturday morning cartoon jobs, much like Kricfalusi had. These are those artists. A lot of these artists would go on to work with Kricfalusi later at Spumco, on Ren and Stimpy, and other productions. And then the remaining portion of the crew that worked on Mighty Mouse were all students from art school, from Cal Arts, in their last semester of their senior year. A lot of these names you might recognize. Rich Moore is the director of Wreck-It Ralph and Zootopia. Andrew Stanton is the director of WALL-E and Finding Nemo. Jim Reardon was a director on The Simpsons, as well as Rich Moore. All credit Ralph Bakshi as a veritable mentor to them.
To have that be the first kind of philosophy that you run into from a studio in your life as an animator is a pretty big thing. The level of trust that he put in us as artists, it was just great.
That was Ed Bell. He was one of the Cal Arts grads that joined the crew. So Ralph Bakshi was a huge influence on these people. They viewed him as like their mentor, their guru figure. They constantly snuck him into the show in different caricatures, different characters. There he is as an evil witch in like a Snow White parody. The bottom right one is a particularly hilarious caricature of him because it looks like something you would draw on a Post-it note. And I imagine it probably was in the studio, and they just snuck that into the boards. Let's see here. Rich Moore at a 2012 talk at Google, he credits Ralph Bakshi.
He was a great man to work with and a mentor to me, because you would look at him and say like, wow, if Ralph can make it in this business, I can too, he was a real artist and a visionary.
John Kricfalusi shares similar praise.
He molds you, and you learn that cartooning is not just like being wimpy all day long. It's like he gets you to put your feelings on the paper, and if you don't, if you're just imitating somebody else, it makes him real mad. So, he's just a character-forming guy.
So Bakshi was actively molding a very young crop of artists to look at the world through his perspective, to add their own perspectives to the mix. He was embracing individual vision, which is the fundamental precursor to the era of animation that would follow Mighty Mouse. And it worked. It was a success. Mighty Mouse was a success among critics and children alike. This is a quote from Peggy Charon, the head of action for children's television. in a McNeil-Lair NewsHour special from 1988. You can tell that Mighty Mouse is a good program because as an adult, when you sit down to watch it, you want to watch it through to the end. Surprisingly high praise for a Saturday morning cartoon from the 1980s. And the secret to this unique success was artist ownership. So then, in examining style, we got to look back at the history of how cartoons are made. The first step in the animation process, as established by Walt Disney in the 1920s, is the storyboarding process. Storyboarding is essentially a method of writing in which the artists draw out the main beats of the story like a comic book. From storyboarding, they move on to layout. So this is a Chuck Jones layout drawing. The layout artists, what they do is they flesh out the action in the boards by drawing the key poses of what will end up being the final animation. The amount of poses the layout artist draws is dependent on the budget and what they and the director determine is necessary to convey the acting. So Chuck Jones, in particular, he was known for doing all of his own layout drawings because that was his particular way of implementing his vision. In addition, there was only one person who ever drew like Chuck Jones, and that was Chuck Jones. Animators also hold poses to better convey the acting when the character is not in constant motion. And as budgets dwindled and as the market expanded, animation blew up. Artists sought to see what could be done with less, making do with less unique poses and relying instead on more held poses. UPA, was mentioned earlier today, is a studio that was formed in the 1940s by artists following mass labor strikes from the major studios. And so they didn't have the budgets of their contemporaries. So they basically heralded the techniques that would later be called limited animation. And then as animation began to be produced for television, UPA's methods needed to be adapted by all the other studios who were trying to produce content in a quarter of the time and for far less money than they had when producing theatrical shorts. Filmation, the studio that John Kricfalusi worked for in the early 1980s, was renowned for producing some of the cheapest TV animation productions. The entire process of layout was eliminated. Doesn't exist anymore. Instead, it was delegated to the overseas animators, and it was no longer viewed as a creative process. And in its place were libraries of stock poses to be assembled mechanically as necessary. Characters rarely moved, were stiff, and mostly spoke, with most action taking place off screen. Writing by way of storyboards was also outmoded, with television screenwriters, a far more commonplace and economical resource, taking on those roles. So in all ways, style had become homogenized and no longer bore an individual hand. Animation was as assembly line produced as possible in the 1980s. So when Bakshi and Kricfalusi ran the zoo, when they had their chance to do things their way, they decided they were going to do things differently. John Kricfalusi, in an interview with Wired in 2010, we split the crew into 4 units, just like Looney Tunes. Each unit headed by a director who would follow the cartoon from script to final edit. Everyone had a creative stake in the outcome of the films. Our content was so different that we had to really make the characters come alive on screen. In the layouts, we would draw tons of unique poses and expressions, tailored to the dialogue tracks, so that the drawings would match all the inflections in the actors' voices. We also added lots of visual gags in the layouts that weren't written in the scripts. According to Kricfalusi, if it weren't for this process, the creative innovations of the show would not have showed up on screen. And the character designs were fun to look at. You know, they weren't drawn as robotic models to make it easier on the overseas animators, but rather looked more like something an animation student might doodle in their sketchbook. Here is Mighty Mouse in the show actually doodling a drawing, which is actually a caricature of John Kay at the time.
Yes.
But the caveat of all this, they're doing all this extra work, they're doing these layout drawings, they still had a television budget, so layout drawings had to be done quickly and with little to no revision. And so this resulted in drawings that often made little sense and that changed wildly at any given moment. This is the least of it. He pulls his eyes and he recoils and he actually turns into a pile of dust after that. So this resulted in drawings that looked more like Cubist Picasso paintings than classic cartoons. But when looking at a Picasso against a backdrop of G.I. Joes and Transformers and Care Bears, Picasso wins out. It's just far more interesting. And so these flaws, these rough edges, became part of the trademark style of what made Mighty Mouse so unique. The trademark style of Mighty Mouse and New Adventures could almost be called irresponsibly indulgent, unlike anything that had ever been on TV or would be again. The wonky backgrounds are also another trademark aspect of the Mighty Mouse style that you begin to see in a lot of shows after Mighty Mouse. More Picasso stuff. Yeah, looks like Guernica right there. This is a background character. Mighty Mouse and New Adventures was also in story more akin to Monty Python's Flying Circus than the New Adventures of Tom and Jerry or other contemporary Saturday morning cartoon fare.
If anybody thought of anything that would make everybody else laugh, then it was good. And we'd figure out a way to put it in.
So that was story artist Mike Cazella. Eddie Fitzgerald, another story artist.
We just want to make fun of like every convention conceivable, basically.
So the result is that Mighty Mouse was a veritable precursor to The Simpsons with an off-the-charts joke density. And as Mighty Mouse and New Adventures evolved, it would find itself parodying or ridiculing everything from 60s science fiction films to Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead to Terry Toons and the Mighty Mouse universe itself to meta-commentaries about fellow Saturday morning cartoons and even CBS. We watched, if you're here for the screening, we watched the episode Don't Touch That Dial, which has parodies of the Flintstones mixed with the Jetsons, Scooby-Doo, Rocky and Bullwinkle, and the real Ghostbusters. This is what the co-writer of that episode, Tom Minton, had to say.
Ralph once said, a film or a cartoon is only good if it's a reaction against something else. And Mighty Mouse is a reaction against a lot of mediocrity.
And as the show went on, the story artists realized that Mighty Mouse wasn't even the most interesting thing about the show. John Kay and crew brimming with ideas for new characters would often seek ways to actively write Mighty Mouse out. While Bakshi and CBS purportedly scolded his crew for not featuring the title character enough, this was all part of the natural evolution of the show, which found itself a creative writing sandbox rather than a formula-driven action serial. Kricfalusi's crew wasn't afraid of a fluidity of vision, which allowed the show to evolve alongside the interests of the writers. While not being a safe bet for the network, this method broke the ground for the era of TV animation which was to follow, where looking different and acting irreverent suddenly became an asset rather than a liability. Mighty Mouse wouldn't last past the second season. Its unpredictable nature, the volatile influences of Bakshi and Kricfalusi, and CBS's lack of control eventually got the show canceled. But the impact of the show had not gone away. The following year, in 1988, a pup named Scooby-Doo premieres on ABC, which has wacky, exaggerated character designs and wonky backgrounds. You hadn't seen that stuff before Mighty Mouse. Then the year after that, you see the Beetlejuice animated series, similar stylistic elements. And then after that, The Simpsons premieres on Fox. It's a primetime animated TV show geared not at children, but at adults, something that Ralph Bakshi might have liked to have done. And then, suddenly, everyone was clamoring for their own unique cartoons, and an artist's own trademark style became their calling card rather than, a liability. Nickelodeon and Cartoon Network launched in the early 90s. Nickelodeon is the first out of the gate with original programming in 91, Jim Jenkins' Doug, Klasky Csupo's Rugrats, and of course the Ren and Stimpy show, created by none other than Mighty Mouse's John Kricfalusi. Cartoons had original voices again, and it was the writers and the artists that were giving it to them. While Mighty Mouse, The New Adventure should be taken as its own unique concoction of circumstances, it represented a fundamental junction point in the history of animation. Before 1987, the landscape of TV animation was homogeneous and formulaic, but after 1987, you begin to see original programs that wouldn't have been engineered if you're looking for systematic solutions to what kids were going to like. And you have an environment that's actually far more likely to show audiences what's so valuable about the medium of animation. And it was all thanks to the renegade rebel of the animation industry, Ralph Bakshi.
Our Mountain Studios, we did it the old-fashioned way, is to let the cartoonists write the material and do the storyboards. And then they had gags. That's just a tradition of animation. I'll let the guys perform. And you know what? They perform above. They can't believe that they're free and they perform well. That's the major Bakshi secret. You hire talented guys and tell them not what to do. A lot of studios hire talented guys and tell them how to do it. It's mindless. It boggles the imagination. It's like hiring Norman Rockwell and telling them how to draw.
So in this way, a group of young artists ultimately pushed the medium forward by recalling the methods of the golden age of animation, all thanks to industry rebel Ralph Bakshi. Thanks, that's all.